Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. Today I've come to Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government to speak to Tom Hale, Professor of Public Policy. I'm going to talk to him about the topic of his new book, Long Problems, which is about climate change and democracy. Tom, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
It's a pleasure. So we always ask our guests to start with the same question, and that question is, in one sentence, what do you see as the biggest problem with democracy right now?
Well, the problem I focus on in the book, which is a huge problem for democracy and indeed every other governance system we have, is managing long-term problems in a world where human institutions push us towards short-termism.
Okay, great. So let's get stuck into that topic. So in your book, you use a powerful metaphor to describe the condition we're in. You talk about humanity's condition resembling someone who's jumped off a tall building and is just beginning to realize that the ground is fast approaching. Can you unpack this metaphor a bit more for us?
Yeah, so for many of the things that focus our attention and take our time in society today, we feel like we have started on something we don't know where it's going to end, like a person jumping off a tall building and looking blissfully around, thinking about all the lovely view you have on the way down, and then you sort of glimpse the ground coming into view. And for something like climate change or some of the technological developments we've seen, we don't really know, I think, where they're going to take us. And the motivation for this book is thinking about how we, as societies, can govern that problem more effectively.
Okay, so that's a kind of a long problem, right? The title of your book. So what exactly do you mean by a long problem? What is a long problem?
So I define problem length, which can be long or short, as the distance between the cause and the effect a problem might have. So you might think of, for example, a forest fire as quite a short problem because it may start from a spark from a camper or something like that and then have an immediate impact on the local area and then burn away. Whereas something like climate change, which arguably could have been a contributing factor to that long problem, spans decades or centuries or even more. So think about problem length as something that all problems have, cause and effect, and long problems being the ones where problem length spans more than one human generation.
So the central idea of your book is that democracies struggle to govern long problems. Is this just a problem that democracies have, or is this something that all states have, autocracies, everyone?
It's something that all human institutions have. Democracies, autocracies, all political systems, private corporations, any kind of unit will have this sort of problem at differing degrees. And the focus I have in the book, of course, is on governments and governance and how collective decision-making tools work. And people often worry about what they call a democratic myopia, where I think mostly driven by elections and these kinds of cycles we have in politics in representative democracy, people worry they kind of only focus on the next period, the next little time, maybe even the next media cycle. The research, though, shows pretty clearly that even though elections do have a kind of foreseen moment that creates this short-term pressure, the absence of elections is not the way you get rid of that. So people point to the Chinese system or the Singaporean system as being particularly good, maybe at long-term planning. There's lots of pressures, though, for short-termism in those systems as well. So it's a general problem. It doesn't only apply to democracies. And indeed, if you look at which governments around the world are making the most investment in, say, early childhood education, or preventative approaches to healthcare, or long-term budget stability, or indeed climate action, they tend to be the liberal democracies, the Swedens, the Denmarks, the Switzerlands, the ones that you might expect. So there's certainly no autocratic advantage on long-term governance, and I would argue that actually many of the democratic factors that push us toward good public good provision, which is a general feature of well-functioning democracies, also help here. But of course, the point of the book is that all institutions, all societies, all political systems need to do a lot better to manage long problems.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think if you look at the record of dictatorships, they're no better, they're worse than democracies at dealing with climate change. So let's talk more about climate change. So climate change is central to your book as the key long problem. What makes climate change such a long problem, and is it still a long problem given that we're now already facing quite acute impacts?
I think climate change is a case par excellence of a long problem. So the main factor behind the greenhouse effect, the warming the planet experiences, is a long-term accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There are other gases that matter as well, but carbon is a big one. And carbon has a really interesting feature where once you burn it, from coal or oil or whatever the thing might be, it lasts in the atmosphere for a very long time, maybe as long as a century or two, for it to entirely dissipate. And so the whole problem of climate change is driven by this cumulative effect. People, they can often miss this scientific point, but it's not about the year-to-year change in emissions that matters. It's the total historical accumulation of emissions that matters. That's for the creation of climate change. But what about dealing with climate change, how to adapt to its impacts? That's also, I would argue, a very long-term process. If you need to build, say, new infrastructure or a new city, or to change how you're deploying certain kinds of agricultural industries and to adapt to changing climates, to move populations, these also tend to span a lot of time. So both on the nature of the problem, the creation of climate change, and also the way we adapt to its impacts, we're talking about a centuries-long problem.
So across that century, you talk in the book about 3 different possible scenarios of how climate change could turn out. Can you talk us through those scenarios and how they might interact with different types of democratic decision?
So one of the things that I think I found really helpful in writing this book is for social scientists to engage a bit more than we have as disciplines with this idea of scenarios, of creating different visions of the future that are internally logically consistent, but aren't necessarily empirically verifiable because, of course, they're looking forward to the future. And I think the scenario methodology, which is common in different areas, is actually something we social scientists could use a bit more. So in that spirit, I try to think through a few different outcomes and pathways that might now be emerging. And the first is actually not one that might be emerging, but actually a counterfactual, the path we didn't take, which is, of course, the one we should have taken, the long-term efficient solution, which is to start with early emissions reductions and to make it a gradual and consistent process across a long period of time. That would have been really attractive. So in 1992, every country in the world gathered in Rio de Janeiro to sign a document that said in international law, we commit to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And of course, for year after year after year, they've met in these conferences of the parties, the COPs we all hear about in the news, and have made some but limited progress on that promise. If they had actually done that, though, in the beginning, think of how much more efficient they'd be. The change would have been slow and gradual. You could have had a gradual mechanism for giving certainty to, say, fossil fuel interests or workers in that sector who would need to phase down. They could say, okay, your job is going to be fine. We're going to have a kind of long-term phase-out. The fiscal transfers needed to effectuate that could have been priced in a very consistent, easy way. And we could have had a lot of time to develop the technology and the kinds of solutions that will make that transition much more smooth and efficient. That is a road not taken. Instead, we're now at a choice, I would say, between a sort of high mitigation, late but rapid mitigation scenario where we really get our acts together, and a late but not very rapid mitigation scenario where we don't get our acts together. And that's really the choice we have before us now. And both those scenarios are much less attractive than the one that a proper long-term approach would have set us on, but they have pretty starkly different implications. So if we have to really ramp up mitigation now, which I would argue is still the more attractive path, we're talking about making big investments in technology. We have to really push down the learning curve in a really rapid way. We have to deal with lots of interest groups, lots of people who are negatively affected by a rapid, sudden disruption in how we generate energy, for example, plus in other sectors. And of course, even because we're further down the emissions pathway, we still have to do a lot of adaptation. We have to do the adaptation quickly because the impacts are here. We're not able to take decades to do the planning and the long-term infrastructure development or the movement that we need to do. So it's going to be really rushed, really rapid. And I think we saw, for example, in the COVID-19 crisis, how when you have that kind of crisis condition where prevention wasn't done sufficiently, the rapid reaction is costly, it's politically disruptive, and it leads to much lower outcomes. Now that's the medium scenario. The third scenario is the worst one, is of course we don't do that prevention work, and we have to do radical adaptation, or maybe even things like putting giant space mirrors in to reflect sunlight, seeding clouds to try to reverse the warming we're experiencing. Those are even more disruptive still. So those are the pathways ahead of us. We've missed option 1, but the good news is that the difference between option 2 and 3 is huge, and that's within our agency.
Climate change is a key long problem that you talk about in the book, but are there any other long problems?
Yeah, so I think problem length, like I say, is a feature of any problem. We can think of it that way. And there are lots of ones that are quite long. So one that I also think about a lot these days is demographic change. We live in a world where most societies are aging, with the exception of parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But most societies are going through a pretty strong and rapid demographic transition toward an older society. And many of our systems, notably pensions, are set up in a way to presume a certain structure of age, age distribution in society, and a certain way of work happening, and all of those assumptions need to be revisited. So here's a great example of where the nature of human life changes, maybe in good ways, maybe through economic development or better healthcare, et cetera, but leading to these kind of long-term changes that need to be addressed. Other ones I'd like to think about are infrastructure development for like urban planning. The choices we made here in the city of Oxford in the Middle Ages are still constraining and affecting how people move around the city, or house prices, things that matter for people today. So there's many, many long problems, and climate change to me is just a really good example.
Let's talk a bit about the drivers behind long-term problems. So you talk in the book about shadow interests. Can you tell us what a shadow interest is and why that's a problem for democracy?
So the core idea of a shadow interest is that people in the future, who are people affected by long problems, sort of by definition, the cause and effect are separated by more than a human generation. So those people, many of them aren't here yet. Those people don't have any agency in politics today. They don't exist, so they can't raise their hand and say, no, I don't like this, I don't like that. And actually, as you know, Keith, like in many kinds of politics, change or some kind of political impetus comes from some group being negatively affected by something and rising up against that thing, whether it's colonialism or the creation of the welfare state or all these things. Like this sort of impetus for even disenfranchised people to rise up and push for something is a big force and dynamic in politics that we really kind of count on to drive different kinds of institutional change. If those people don't exist, if they're only shadows that we can kind of glimpse dimly through the future, then they don't have that agency. They have to rely on us, people in the present, to either share their interests or understand them in some way and to act on them. And therefore, they're really constrained in what they can do. So that's the idea of shadow interests.
So it's so the people who are going to be worst affected aren't actually at the table. They don't get a vote and they can't even come out and protest. And I guess it's not just about future generations. It's that some of the people that will be affected are in other countries and so can't vote in the countries that are the highest polluters.
Yeah, well, that's exactly an analogous problem. So, many normative theorists have thought for a long time about the global justice dimensions and why should a decision taken in one country, if it affects other countries, why should people in those other countries not have some say in that decision? That's a big problem in democratic theory, right? And why we have theories of global justice and global republicanism and these different ideas. It's the same for generations, but in some ways the tools for how you do that are a little bit more remote, a little bit more difficult to find because people in other countries still have agency, right? They can protest or they can work through their governments in set of ways. If you don't exist, the agency problem is much harder.
Yeah. So we've got shadow interests as central to why democracies struggle with long-term problems. Are there any other reasons why they struggle?
So the thing I try to do in the book is to use my field, political economy, to try to think through the political barriers for what makes long problems politically hard problems. There's sort of an intuition I think people would have that, we're very short-termist in our thinking, institutions are very slow and kind of presentist focused, and that's what's hard. But I think we stand a much better chance of making progress on long problems if we have a more precise understanding of how they present political difficulties. And so alongside the shadow interest lens, the two other barriers I try to focus on in the book I call the institutional lag problem and the early action paradox. So the institutional lag problem comes from this idea that as time expands, as the problem length increases, the nature of that problem can change a lot. But institutions, the way we solve a problem, either a law, a policy, a regulation, an organization, an agency, something more permanent, all those things have to be a little bit durable and sticky, so they're not going to be an institution. They have to endure. And so as time expands and the potential for change increases, you get potentially more of a mismatch between the solution you have and the problem you face. We see that all throughout the climate change example. My favorite, I think the most powerful demonstration is for many, many years in the international climate change process, it was impossible to talk about adaptation. People didn't want to think about the impacts of climate change because they felt that would be sort of a moral hazard, a slippery slope to basically giving up on prevention. But as prevention became less and less satisfying and more and more treatment was needed, the people who were at the sharp end of that, mostly small developing countries, said, hey, we need to really talk about adaptation. And still, I would say most of the effort and certainly most of the funding is going more to mitigation than to adaptation for a host of reasons. But this sort of stickiness to be able to look ahead and say, actually, we need to think about treatment as well as prevention is a great example of this institutional lag problem.
One of the great things about your book is you don't just tell us what the problems are, you also start to propose solutions and propose how democracies can deal better with these long-term problems. Can you talk us through some of those solutions?
Yeah, and this is really, I think, like the key message I try to convey in the book. And I hope anyone who might be listening to this podcast takes away one thing. It'll be we can solve long problems. We can at least mitigate them. And we have hundreds and hundreds of examples of people doing that in different times and places around the world today. So it's not something where this is somehow an intractable, impossible flaw in human nature or human institutions that is beyond our remedy. Actually, precisely because a lot of this comes from the rules, the institutions we create. That means we can adjust how we address them, and that's really the main message. Let me just give a few concrete examples. One I think has gotten a lot of attention around the world is the Wales Commissioner for Future Generations, which was created by Wales in 2015. It's basically a kind of independent but official gadfly in government whose job it is to say, hey, Welsh politicians, you haven't thought about the long-term implications of this. And one thing the previous commissioner did, I think, really well was to work with the Welsh health system to finally drive through, after many years of thinking they should do this but not acting on it, a series of quite useful reforms that invest more in prevention, like preventative healthcare, in order to save money on treatment down the line. And this is what every health system knows they need to do. Every report you read on the NHS or other sources will say, prevention is where we need to invest. But it's actually quite hard for bureaucracies, for politicians to make the right kinds of investments there because of this long-term problem. You don't get credit for doing prevention. You get credit for something around changing waiting times in the future, which of course important in the present, which of course important as well. But because it's sort of on the back burner, it never gets done, and therefore we never kind of get out of this cycle. But having this institutional role in Wales actually allowed sort of the allies in the bureaucracy, in the Welsh healthcare bureaucracy, to actually finally drive through some things they've been wanting to do for a long time. So it just was a small, if you will, adjustment in the salience of who is paying attention and how much effort they were investing in it. But that little institutional nudge led to I would say, useful policy outcome. So that's, I think, a great example of how just representing future generations in some way, having a voice for them, can actually change the equation politically in a positive way.
There's a couple of other examples you give of things democracies can do. One is using trusteeship, and the other was using citizens' assemblies to help with long-termism. Can you talk us through those solutions?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting to me, thinking about this from the perspective of democracy, is a lot of people, I think rightly, are frustrated with various ways in which democracy works today. The podcast explores these different dimensions. And I think there's things within the wider democratic toolkit that we can and should be applying to long problems that would also just make our democracies work better generally. So complementing representative democracy as we usually practice it today with both more technocratic kind of arm's length bodies like trustees and more bottom-up deliberative participatory bodies like citizens' assemblies, I think help to, from different angles, build out the toolkit of what democracy could look like. So I think it's really promising. Trustees, what do we mean by that? So an agent is someone you create to do what you want. A trustee is someone you empower to keep you from doing what you want. So classic examples in politics are central banks, which we intentionally create as arm's length bodies to preserve monetary stability, or courts, where we want some kind of check on the government in some way. And in the climate change space, there's a really interesting body, which I look at in the book, called the California Air Resources Board, which is, I think, the closest we have to a kind of climate trustee. It's a very independent regulatory agency in the state of California, which is basically in charge of implementing California's climate change targets. So when the legislature sets a climate target, it's often like a very short 2-page bill, kind of a very high-level law, and then all of the how and the what gets put into this very technocratically skilled and quite powerful regulatory agency that, for example, runs the emissions trading system. It sets vehicle standards, it sets power plant standards, there's all these kinds of things. And it's accountable to the usual democratic procedures, but it has its immediate governance of a board, like the sort of board you might have governing a central bank, and it has budgetary independence, has lots of things that give it this sort of trustee-like quality. And I would argue the success of California in progress on climate change, and it is a lot of success, it has a lot to do with this sort of institutional structure. So that's, I think, where we're seeing a kind of institutional innovation pointing the way of how to address the long problem.
So one of the things you talk about in the book is that democracies need to become both more adaptable, but in other ways more durable to deal with long problems, and that these two things can come into conflict. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that and why they come into conflict?
Yeah, one of the research moments I really enjoyed with the book was reading this exchange of letters between two founders of the American Republic, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And Thomas Jefferson, who was the more radical of the two, had the view that actually it's kind of like a form of tyranny for a law to last more than a certain amount of time, because then the people who have created that law in the past are kind of controlling what the people in the present are doing. So we should have laws that only last 19 years, which was his understanding of what a generation was, and they should all expire at that point. And James Madison, who is the more pragmatic maybe of the two, thought that wouldn't really work very well for a new government, so we shouldn't have that kind of way. But the question is, I think, a really interesting one, like what should be the right lifespan of any human institution? And for long problems, I think that dilemma, that trade-off comes really to the fore, because you need to have the right mix, if you will, of durability. You have to set, say, a long-term mitigation goal for climate change. You have to understand what you're trying to achieve with your fiscal balance to maintain goals over time. You have, like, for example, the pact behind the euro, which is a sort of set of commitments countries are making for what their fiscal balance will be over a long period of time. You need that kind of long-term goal and durability, but you also have to adapt it as things change. And what I'm worried about is that many times we don't really ask ourselves that question. So there's no thinking when a law or a regulation or an institution is created about how to strike the right balance between adaptability and durability. And I don't have an answer about what that, is it 19 years, is it 25 years, is it 100 years? But the point is that we need a process for at least asking that question when a new rule comes into effect. So, I saw this also really clearly when, and recently in the United States, the Supreme Court, as many people have heard, struck down Roe v. Wade and therefore reverted back to the states in the question of abortion. And suddenly, overnight, all of these people living in Arizona found themselves bound by an 1864 law, which prohibited abortion and indeed had a number of other kind of 19th century provisions and views on human society. And so this kind of lack of exploration was really a problem. At the same time, you have to have some kind of way of putting durability in. So I guess this dilemma needs to be addressed in kind of through a mix of what I call goals and triggers. So you set long-term goals, but you have sunset clauses in them and review moments that come up at different intervals. If you have that kind of system sort of de facto, that's your default way of making policy, to have both long-term anchoring points and moments of revision, you're going to at least be able to navigate this trade-off in a smooth way. If you don't do that, de facto you're making a choice that either we have permanent things that never change, or we have things that are always subject to revision, and that's never the right balance.
Okay, the getting there question. We know what the problem is. We know what some of the solutions are. How do we get there? You say in the book that climate change might provide a pathway for achieving a more long-term form of governance. How would that work?
So I think we're seeing lots of examples of what I would call long-term governance solutions popping up all the time. Last year, the South Korean Constitutional Court ordered the government to set a more ambitious climate change target because it said it was unfair to future Koreans to not do so. So a kind of legal case that took on this view. In the most recent, after the most recent European Union elections, there's now a commissioner in the EU who has intergenerational fairness as part of his portfolio. We've seen the Senate in Kenya this year create a committee for the future to have a kind of future scanning function built into the legislative process in Kenya. So there's lots of different examples of people trying to do this. And I think the question is, how do we encourage and scale up this sort of groundswell of different solutions? There's no like silver bullet panacea here in the book. It's definitely not like, here's the 3 things you need to do to manage long-term problems. But encouraging this big trend is exactly what we need to do. Will climate change help us? I think it can if we see it in the right way. So as the impacts of climate change increase, I worry that actually it's going to push us in a more short-term direction. If you're the mayor of a city that's been over 50 degrees Celsius at night every night for the past week, are you going to invest more in mitigation, or are you going to invest more in like life-saving air conditioners? Of course, you have to invest more in the treatment and less in the prevention at that point. I think we're now in the scenario where we're really at this sort of tipping point where we see enough of the impacts to have high salience on the issue, but we still have a lot of scope to do meaningful prevention, not as much as we would have liked to, but still quite meaningful prevention. And so I find this like moment really critical for how we think about that. And the choice is ours.
Whose choice is it, though? Who are the people that can affect this change? Is this something governments do? Is it something citizens can do? Is it academics or someone else? Who should be driving this change?
I think it takes everyone, obviously, but we as academics have an important role to play in studying these different mechanisms. And it's really striking to me how in political science there's not a larger literature around how these different kinds of innovations I mentioned work and under what conditions problem length leads to different kinds of outcomes. So we have a research agenda definitely in our field. But I think one thing I would really point to is for the activists and civil society community on climate change to add a more long-term lens to their work. There's a lot of climate activists who always think, why are we always losing? Why is it always so hard to make progress? And there's certainly been lots of progress, but there's always a sense that there's never enough political will, there's never enough power around this issue to really drive the changes people think would be useful. I think a lot of people feel frustration about that. And what I would say to them is, institutions, the reason why there's not more progress is because the rules of the game are tilted against better governance of long-term problems for all the reasons: the shadow interest problem, the institutional ag problem, the early action paradox problem as well. And so you have to change those institutions if you want to have more political will. You have to change those institutions if you want to build more effective political power around long-term problem solving. And the good news is that you can change institutions. Institutions are things that we build, and we can alter them. So what I would try to encourage is for the climate change activist community to take on what you might call an institutional agenda on climate change. And you see also examples of this. I think you see it in the climate litigation work that's using for future generations, like the Korean case I mentioned. You see it in, for example, the UK's 2010 Climate Change Act, which creates the UK Climate Change Committee, which I think is a useful tool for long-term governance as well. So there are bits and pieces of it, but a much more robust institutional framework would actually put us in a much easier path for managing the problem. And for activists to take that view, I think would be quite inspiring.
Yeah, and you see it, Extinction Rebellion as well was calling for citizens' assembly. So I think there is a growing awareness of the links between climate change and democratic short-termism. But some people are going to worry that right now we're facing a climate crisis that's upon us. We should be dealing with that. And on top of that, we've got global tensions. Is this the right time to be making these kind of big changes to democracy? Can we even do it in this global context that we're in?
Yeah, I think the usual answer on all things to do with climate change is that the best time to do it would have been a few decades ago, and the second best time is right now. And so the nature of this cumulative historical problem is exactly that. It's never too late, because every degree of effort you put in today is a big savings in the future. So yes, I think it makes sense. But the challenge is, how do you make progress on long-term governance when you have so many urgent crises? And actually, I think it's really striking that people, I think, understand, including from living through the COVID pandemic, that there's a real link between the urgent crises we face and the long-term drivers that underpin them. Last year, countries agreed for the first time at the UN something called the Declaration on Future Generations, at a moment of pretty sharp geopolitical tension where nothing else could really be agreed, frankly, at the last UN General Assembly summit. But they came up with this declaration, and actually it was agreed to unanimously by countries at the time. And it's an aspirational normative document, and it's nothing more, nothing less. But aspirational normative documents in the UN have a history of actually being catalysts, of seeds for deeper changes. Think back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights after World War II. It was a similar kind of aspirational document, but it was trying to respond to a moment in history and to point a way forward. And I think I was encouraged to see that even in the world of geopolitical tension, there's sufficient consensus that we need to leave this world a better place for people to come, even if we disagree on what that might look like. And I think that in there lies some seeds for hope. That would be pretty meaningless if it weren't connected to these more bottom-up groundswell of changes I mentioned. Like all these different innovations we see around the world are making that real. And if we have this consensus morally, this is the right way to go, we have goals like the Declaration on Future Generations that point us in the right direction, and we have practical tools bubbling up for a whole variety of different reasons, I think that's quite an encouraging set of conditions for a longer-term change.
Nice trend on reasons to hope and reasons to be optimistic. So we like to do at the end of the podcast a round of quick-fire questions. So here we go. Firstly, what's one thing that governments are doing well to address climate change?
Renewable energy has expanded hugely, 3 times increase in the last 3 years. Let's do more.
Second, what's the most effective way to communicate the urgency of climate change to a skeptical audience?
Security, energy security for countries, security for people's houses against floods and wildfires. Security is the way to go.
What's your go-to source for information about climate change and democratic governance?
In the mainstream media, Bloomberg and the Financial Times do a good job. Outside that, I'd say Heat Map News is great, and Ember.
What do you find most frustrating about current responses to climate change?
This is personal, but I'm particularly frustrated at the moment with the bureaucratic infighting in the UN over climate change.
What's the most inspiring example of long-term governance, as the title of your book, that you've seen?
I want to end by talking this is a major shout out to the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner. They're a great example, and many can learn from Wales.
And looking to the future, are you hopeful or pessimistic?
So for me, hope is all about, do you have agency to make an impact on shaping the future? And I see huge opportunity for that. And so in that sense, yes, I am hopeful.
Great. Lastly, we asked you at the beginning of the episode, what do you think is the biggest problem with democracy? After everything we've discussed about long problems, climate change, if you had one thing that you could choose to do differently in democracy, what would that be?
It would be complementing our usual tools with this more bottom-up, deliberative, participatory mechanism, and the more trustee, technocratic type mechanism, and creating these as sort of boundaries and contributions to what a new vision of democracy could look like. I think Dahl said something like, the future democracy in the future will look very different from anything we imagine today, and I think in that insight lies a lot of inspiration.
Let's hold on to that. Tom, thank you for joining us on the show. It's been great to have you. I hope you've enjoyed listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media. I'm your host, Keith Hyams. Thank you for tuning in.